Hello, my name is Lori Frome. I work in York County, Pennsylvania as an early interventionist, and I'm serving our youngest of children with red flags for autism or with ASD diagnosis. They are under 3. I'm really excited to be here with you today, with our service members, with our providers, to continue on with Dr. Doan's message of healthy service members, healthy families, and a healthy force. This story is one of my own experiences and also one of research, and I will share with you how electronic screen media affects our youngest of children and why removing the media from a young child's view who is at risk for ASD may be beneficial to maximizing their development as well as their neurological progress. I have both experience in my practice seeing positive change using this method. With high amounts of social interaction paired with it, research intervention strategies that are research-based also paired with it, as well as personal experience, as I said, with my own son Max, who was diagnosed with ASD just last year, and he responded amazingly to this protocol. I share today out of love and caring and concern for our young children who have an inherited pregenetic disposition to ASD, like my own son. I also share with compassion for their families, like mine, who have been affected by this disorder. I come with 2 questions today to pose that are based in scientific research and data. First, could we unintentionally be causing harm to a child that has a pregenetic disposition to ASD through very early screen exposure in large quantities due to the nature of a child's brain that has unregulated and very high neuroplasticity? Second, do we not fully comprehend the importance of everyday social experiences and the developmental experiences that our real life provides and that the human brain has developed connectivity to over the past 200,000 years? Again, I thank you for having me here today to share my experiences and to explore these questions. The story of Max. My son Max received a level 1 high-functioning ASD diagnosis in February of last year. He was exposed to about 3 to 4 hours of screen media a day, his first months of life due to my suffering from a horrible bout of postpartum depression. He was placed in front of screens. I felt, for a better lack of words, then he became sensory dependent on the screens. I felt better at about 9 months, when he was 9 months. And I started trying to take him away from the screens. I knew the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation against no screens, and I was only exposing him because I wanted to keep him home with me to breastfeed him. Unfortunately, when I tried to take him away, he would become really fussy and intolerable for much of the day, kind of like what we describe as that purple crying period. And so what I would do was then place him back in front of the screens to help regulate him sensorily, his mood and the way he was acting. The screen was an easy soother for him, and I was like, he's gonna outgrow this stage. This is just a stage. I can get through it, and he will too. Unfortunately, he didn't outgrow that, and the screen media became a larger and larger part of his own life, as well as our family's, due to the way his behavior was. At about 30 months, he began repetitive behavior that looked more and more like high-functioning ASD in a 3.5-year-old. He was spinning and isolating much of the day when not occupied with an adult. We pursued testing for him, and it was at this time that we decided to remove all screens from his view. Here you may be wondering why I chose this method. A year prior to this experience with my son, who had what I want to describe as more of a regressive case of autism, I had witnessed a family of a child that was 2.5 years old that had marked red flags for ASD. Remove all screen media of their own accord. They made this decision because they felt like their child was more interactive when not in front of the screens. They also removed any light-up toys. He had some computer kind of gadgets that he liked to play with, and they substituted these things for things that I had been showing them, and modeling to play with, such as Play-Doh and reading books and Mr. Potato Head and all the kind of things that we were raised to play with when we were little. This child then quickly turned right in front of my eyes of one that was severely affected to one that became typical developing with just a language delay in only 9 months. Another 9 months later, this child went on to be discharged from all therapy, speech included. His 18-month change, I don't know how to describe it besides miraculous. And it greatly intrigued me for the rest of the time since I had witnessed it. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years in the field. So I prayed with all my heart that this would work for my own son to show such dramatic changes as this one child that I had witnessed just a year before. And it was in January, the first week of January of 2015, that we decided to remove all screens from Max. Went a little bit ahead there, okay. So, I feel that we must meet our children with ASD in their world and bring them into ours. This is something that Sunrise, a program that works with children with ASD, also recommends. Every parent with ASD has felt rejection by their child due to their lack of desire to interact with us in typical ways. It's the nature of the disorder, but it hurts as a parent. I experienced this too, and it's a vicious cycle. I've seen it in the field as well. The parent begins to unconsciously reach out less to their child because their child doesn't respond in typical ways and because the pain of rejection hurts too badly. I've experienced this often with my son, which led to me placing him back in front of the TV, thinking, well, this made him happy. I can't make him happy, so let me just put him in front of the television because that makes him happy. Instead, the opposite is true. True of what our children with ASD need. They need us. They need us desperately at this time in childhood where their brain has a high amount of neuroplasticity. Their brain must be rewarded and see the positive things that come when being involved in social interaction and activities with others of importance. So I started meeting Max where he was, and I started joining him in this spinning, and that looked a little different over time. It evolved by, first of all, me standing back and barely an eye shot of him when he was spinning and taking a blanket just like he was doing and looking out of my peripheral vision at it. Then he would get mad and come over and try to pull the blanket off, and so I would just sit there and watch him and then start again. And eventually, as weeks flowed into about a month's time, it turned into like a ring around the rosy game and became social, and I joined him in his stimming and found eye contact with that and saw this look in his eye that was like, Mom, you're pretty cool. I like spending time with you. So that's how it started, our relationship. It started with more social interaction. I just met him where he is and kind of pulled him back into our world. There's activities that I recommend doing during screen elimination for a young child with ASD. And these were the same activities that I first witnessed the family doing with their child that I saw about a year before. And these are also activities that I did firsthand with Max as well, and I'm now seeing work with other children. We have to disconnect ourselves as much as possible. As caregivers with our children, our relationship is the most important one that they have. And like I said, they need us, and we have the largest impact on their development. As we know, the best outcomes happen when we start these outcomes with our children with ASD early. Early screening helps to find that. And this could only and I could only offer my full attention if I disconnected myself And so my phone, I would have to place it on vibrate. My emails, they had to wait. I couldn't even hear the ding because I wanted to respond to it. You know, the dopamine in me still works. My rapid text messages had to stop. My Facebook time could only do when he was napping. And I would just leave my phone actually in my car because it was too tempting for me to just keep getting into. So about every 2 hours I would go out and just check it. I am a normal person too with obligation, so that kind of worked for me. I also recommend this with my family, and have been also encouraging some of the families that I work with are big gamers as well. And you know, that's another thing with the video games, like gotta kind of curb the gaming a little bit to be with your kid. They need you right now more than the gaming. So another thing that I did, Another thing that I did was read, and engage. I wasn't able to read much to Max before because he didn't have the attention span to listen to books. Yet I know as a teacher and as an educator, as a provider, the importance that literacy has in our children. But I kept thinking, well, he wasn't interested in it, so how was I supposed to keep his attention for it? So we used television often to have him eat with us. He was very underweight, very picky, as a lot of children with ASD are that were young. So that was the way that we found worked to help him eat. Now that we were disconnecting him, oh my goodness, he was going to starve to death. So I had to basically sit down, sacrifice my own meal, or just eat slower, eat less, and just find books that were really interesting to him and just begin to read to him and the family while we were eating to keep him still. It was during this time that I included as many books as I could at every mealtime. I truly believe that reading to him built his receptive language, his understanding for language. That is such a key core deficit in our children with ASD. And literature also shows that it helps not only the receptive but the expressive language, and his expressive language quickly took off. I feel books were a huge part of that. So I then had to involve him in everyday chores. I did not know how I was going to get anything done around the house. And our house soon began to look like a disaster area. My husband is very neat, has to have everything in line, and I was like, oh my gosh, my son was more important. A cleaning lady with 2 dogs and 3 kids that only comes once a week isn't going to really help too much, so how do I get everything done? I had to involve him. I involved him in everything. So this meant that our therapy time also became chore time. He would help me set the table, full prompting. He, of course, did not want anything to do with it at first, but so I would hold him, walk him, make him do the spoon. And at first it started with very little. Put 1 napkin down, then run away. Do you know what I mean? But then it gradually really built up. He became in a routine. He knew what was expected, and we worked on this together, and I tried to get real low to be on his level and do it with him and talk through it. It became a wonderful therapeutic experience. I, just really like to say that it was therapy at its best because we were getting things done, and yet we were also working together and he was being part of my day. He was really just attached at my hip pretty much for quite a while till I felt like he was able to do the things on his own that I would ask him to do. I also began putting him into a lot bigger part of the routines. Instead of just making his chocolate milk and holding it to my face and saying, say milk. And he would, say something that kind of sounded like milk, and I would give it to him. He began helping me to open the top of the sippy cup, and we'd say, turn. Of course, I'd be right at his eye level, or a little lower. He'd help me open the top of the milk, and we'd say, pour. He'd help me stir it up, put the top back on, all the while I'm labeling what I'm doing and being at his eye level. And while these things took more time, and sometimes I was ready to rip my hair out because I didn't feel like I had the extra minute, I realized that all these little 1 minute here, 1 minute there that I could spare added up to a lot of time that I was saving in the long run, not embedding it in routines to make it make as much sense. So it was really therapeutic. I felt those extra tiny little minutes here and there. We live in Pennsylvania, so it's probably pretty much a lot colder than it is in North Carolina, but this started in January, as I said. Last January was freezing. But we would bundle up, even if you could only see our eyes, and we'd go out on the coldest of days. We'd spend at least 10 minutes, sometimes that was all we could handle, twice a day, just to get that sensory input that only the outside could provide. We also have very rainy March and April in Pennsylvania where we are, so the days when it would rain, I would just encourage him to put on his raincoat. I'd kick the rest of the kids out with him and give them instruments or whatever, they'd be playing in the rain, you know. So there was no day that he really wasn't outside unless he was ill. Just for a little bit, like I said, even if it was the worst of weather, just for a little bit. I did this to encourage lots of sensory experiences that honestly just cannot be reproduced inside. That's what our body's wired to for a long, 200,000 years. Our neurology, I feel, needs that. Next, I also did a lot of crafting experiences with him that provided sensory and tactile experiences. I did these things all at a table with him at the same level or lower, like I said, with the eye contact to promote engagement and socialization. I made sure to provide opportunities to communicate with keeping lids on things, with putting things a little bit out of reach for him, with giving him only a little bit of something. And all of these are just good intervention strategies that I always did with him before, but just seem to make more sense now. And then I included family games that included turn taking and social interaction. We had lost a lot of that, as I said, due to the high screen exposure that we were giving him. We all were exposing more to high screens, and so a lot of our family nights were sat in front of the television watching animation. Instead, we started pulling out things that we hadn't seen in a long time, like Hungry Hippos, Twister, Mr. Mouth, Pop-Up Pirates. At first, it was like pulling teeth to get him to even join us. But little by little, each week, we made like Wednesday our game night. He started getting more and more into it. And all these other routines were helping him to then be with us and be with people instead of isolating and spinning. So everything was helping. So it was not just the games, it was all these things we were doing were adding to each other. So it became easier pretty quickly. Okay. This is a video of Max exactly 1 year and a day after his diagnosis of ASD. Okay, let's write car. Go ahead, write it right here. What letter is that? Mm-hmm. What letter says the sound? What letter is that? Well, I don't understand. What letter is that? Okay. More branch up here for cat. Car has the K sound at the start. Okay. R. What sound do you hear next? Car. What sound is that? R. 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 You heard the R sound for car. I'm going to show you how car is spelled. Okay? So, as you can see, the eye contact, there was appropriate engagement, attention, flexibility, regulation, typical cognitive development. This was a child that, per the Wechsler, just a year and a month ago, scheduled below average cognition. Is all there. You can see a complete developmental trajectory change in the core deficits of ASD, just like I had witnessed 1 year, or just like I had witnessed a year ago in the child before him. So, I'm going to share with you some research regarding developmental effects of television viewing by children under 3, as this has been shown to affect the following developmental domains. So I just want to let you know, first of all, that our pediatricians in York at least are recommending no screen time before 2. And I can only speak of my pediatrician that I saw, but there's not a lot of time for the visit. So of course, these first months of life, we have a lot to get, a lot. My baby's spitting up, my baby's doing this, that. So the screen time was explained in a little handout that they gave in about a sentence. And even as being an educator and an early childhood educator, I still didn't quite understand why they were saying no screen time before 2. I knew, but okay, So my other ones, I did follow the recommendation, but when I had Max, I just was like, breastfeeding's so important, and I breastfed the others. I'm just keeping him home to breastfeed him, even though I probably, looking back, he would have been much better at daycare for the time being due to my postpartum. So it wasn't that I didn't know not to expose him, but I did not know the research at all. And had I known, he would have been in daycare in a heartbeat. So I share this literature with you today that shows the conditions of the single parent, a minority, a mom suffering from maternal depression or PTSD, lower socioeconomic status. They are all associated with the caregiver providing greater amounts of screen time to a very young child in the literature. These same conditions are often found in many of our military service providers, putting their children at risk for higher amounts of screen exposure in early childhood. A literature review by Napier of how ESM affects development, and I say ESM meaning electronic screen media, which would mean the tablet, the smartphone, the DVD player, affects the emotional development of infants. Also found a weak parental attachment, just as I had to Max, that is linked to more TV viewing in early childhood. As I said, our kids need us, they need us desperately, and that weak parental attachment does not allow for proper bonding between the infant and the parent and can hinder the best developmental outcomes. They learn from us, they're wired to learn from us. If that's weak, it's gonna affect them, and it will affect them early, which will set a pattern of later delayed development. According to cognition studies done by Barr and Hain, infants' imitation was significantly greater when using a live demonstration as opposed to a model on television. Children's performance of an imitation task did not even show a positive effect from models until age 3, again, supporting that under 2, no screen time recommendation. We have to question, is there any true learning that can be done by a child under that age? But then we also have to think for our children with ASD. You might be 3, like my son was at the time, but your developmental age is 1.5, say. So when they're experiencing this stuff at 3, should we still be providing it if their developmental age isn't yet 2 or 3 years old? We have to really take these things into a question, and we have to research them. As far as I can tell, there's no research on that. We also know that the infant's brain wires from prior knowledge and prior schema, and an infant does not have the prior schema to make sense of what's on television. Instead of us, when we watch TV and we're experiencing through our judgment, our frontal lobe, that infant isn't developed, just like Dr. Doan said, in that area. So they're experiencing it purely sensorily through auditory senses and through visual senses, and that's what it's wiring to. No understanding is being made. There is also a negative association between screen exposure before the age of 3 and language development. Studies show that even shows like Sesame Street that can be a positive thing for children of lower socioeconomic status or parents that don't really engage their children much. When the child is under 2.5, they're actually detrimental in any situation, cognitive and linguistically. And that was shown by Christakis and Zimmerman. Another study shows that there's statistically significant correlations between poor self-regulation, or the ability for an infant to regulate and calm down, between screen media use in early childhood and high media use. It's found that this assumption in research is probably just not one directional. It's probably just not that the kid's being put in front of the television and so they're more fussy and harder to self-regulate. It's probably also because they're harder to self-regulate and more fussy, just like it was with Max, to put them back in front of the television because it's easier. So again, we have to really think about that and give families strategies for those periods, like the purple crying, or what can I do? Our children learn from experience, from watching, and they pick up a lot from the caregiver. So how can we help them regulate socially? That's what their brain needs. Their brain, again, needs us. And the next part is attention. Again, this was in a book by Christakis and Zimmerman called The Elephant in the Living Room. They report on how television maybe are affecting our youngest of children's attention span. Historically, as Dr. Doan had mentioned, shows were first based on radio shows. Captain Kangaroo, Mr. Rogers, all were very slow paced. Mr. Rogers had one scene change, very slow. It was the train going around the set. So as television evolved, they started doing studies. What held kids' attention? These shows that were slower paced started losing their audience. The kids walked away from the screen quicker. How can we keep the kids more engaged? And they found that animation, the moving letter J instead of a static J, held that attention better. A faster paced screen held that attention better. A faster moving screen. So what research has shown is that this type of screen that moves every 4 to 6 seconds actually takes advantage of a child's orienting response that was found by Pavlov, the same researcher that Dr. Doan quoted with the dog and the tuning fork salivating. So what happens here is that our brain is meant to orient to novelty. So it should be looking at something new every 4 to 6 seconds. A baby is naturally inattentive. Have you ever seen a baby stare for long periods of time at anything besides a television? Correct? Unless it was new. If it's new, they should stare for 2 minutes. We've all seen a baby stare at a television a lot longer than 2 minutes. I've watched one not blink for 4 minutes staring at a television before in a therapy room. So many of these programs then take advantage of the orienting response because every time the screen flips, it becomes new again. The child literally has a very hard time looking away due to a natural response that was probably part of what was spread because it saved the child millions of years ago. The child that screamed because it saw the tiger because it was inattentive behind the rock then was picked up, and that kind of neurological development and programming kept us having a shorter attention span. So these reasons provide significant evidence that these same deficits that are found in ASD are also associated with high screen exposure at a young age to electronic viewing. The deficits of attachment, cognition, language, self-regulation, and attention are all part of the criteria that the red flags that make up the ASD diagnosis for a young child. As professionals working with our very young children, it is our duty to warn parents and our overreaching community to be wary and to proceed with caution and to educate them more on this, as more research is definitely needed in this field before we can confirm screen times media as it being safe to such young and neuroplastic minds. When I ask a lot of the parents that I provide service to if they know, I like to use a lot of reflective questioning, reflective listening. Do you know what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations are? Most of them tell me, 2 to 4 hours, and they think it's just television. They think that the apps are okay. And we're seeing much programming for babies coming in different, direct TV, cable. So we have to think what the message that's being sent by the media is it's okay. Our pediatricians might not have the time to tell them why it's not okay. So unintentionally, This is happening a lot, whether pediatricians are backing up the 2-hour no screen time before or not. There's being very, very mixed messages sent to these parents, especially when a lot of these shows are geared toward learning, letters, numbers, colors, that kind of thing. We want our kids to be smart. Do they realize that they have to become smart through us? We are the conduit for their brain to develop. So, when I first saw the child that I worked with now 2 years ago take such a developmental trajectory change for the better, I was the only therapist in the house at the time. It had been a month that were between visits when the child disconnected due to weather and other circumstances. There was nothing else that could explain this child making the trajectory change that he did, except the screen removal and mom following through with a lot of social interaction time. I went home that night, it was about 7 o'clock, and I spent till 12 o'clock searching everything I could on autism and television. And I found one person's research. And I truly believe that this person's research has saved my son, as well as those that I'm spreading this message to. What I had come to find out through the research during this time was that Waldman and Nicholson and Adaloff in 2006 showed a rise over the last 30 years that has been found in association with increased screen media availability and changing viewing habits in infants and toddlers. More screen time viewing in infancy is associated with higher rates of autism in this 2006 paper that looked at precipitation levels in a county, time use statistics, and autism rates. They found a positive correlation between autism rates in a birth year cohort and the extent of possible screen viewing when that cohort was under 3. They also looked at the same cohort and the cable subscription rates in these counties and found that the following increase in cable subscription rates was also associated with increasing ASD rates, again, when the cohort was under 3. Don't we owe it to our children and our families affected with ASD to continue research on this association between early screen time and the prevalence of screen media available in early childhood when the ASD rate continues at a dramatic and unexplainable cost to our families and our society with ASD? It is now documented at $2 million per affected child. Can we personally ask the families to bear this burden? Can we ask our society to bear this burden? More recently, Heffler and Ostreicher reviewed the literature on autism and early brain development and brain plasticity. The model published, and they published a paper, the model of ASD causation, proposing that early heightened auditory and stimulation from the screen viewing, when the brain is highly neuroplastic, views and alters the way in which the brain develops connectivity. Studies show that children with ASD are superior at processing auditory and visual stimuli, and they pay attention to sensory stimulus more than they pay attention to people and biological motion in the environment. Could this high amount of early screen exposure that is possibly wiring the connectivity of the brain be orienting them to these auditory and visual and sensory things over people? We have to ask that question. Other studies suggest that the altered auditory and visual brain specialization interferes with social development and with higher brain development, causing then a global delay. Is that hindering the social development of a higher brain function as opposed to it wiring first to its sensory? Is the child then having a harder time wiring, building connection to that upper brain because things are keeping filtered through the sensory, through the auditory, through the visual? We have to ask that question. This model also explains many findings in ASD, including brain alteration, social development, repetitive behaviors, varied spectrum of involvement, and why early intervention is so successful. You take them away from the screen possibly if this model provides consistency You take them away from the screen, lots of hours of early intervention, the brain rewires then more socially. We see positive benefits. Why are we not checking into this further with research studies to determine if this theory remains consistent across the research? Would screens being removed in SIB studies decrease the 20% likelihood of that younger sibling developing ASD? When the rate of ASD is 1 in 68, 1 in 42 for boys, and so much of the research points to this model, this autism causation model, being plausible, do we have any time to waste? Other researchers, such as Chinchaya in this graph, and I'm not sure if you guys can see how clearly it's being shown, but found increased rates of ASD, and this was done in 2011, associated with earlier onset of screen viewing. As you can see in the first column, children started viewing a little over 6 months with ASD. In the control group, which was typical developing, they started viewing at 12.5 months approximately. And in the delayed language group, they started viewing around 7 months, a little bit over 7 months. You can see the number of hours, so much higher in that ASD group. TV viewing at 6 months of age, 4.5 hours, 4.8 hours. Same thing I was exposing my son to. Much of the same thing that I'm seeing with the children I'm involved with. You can see that the typical child, exposed at 12 months is only viewing the 2 hours, the language delayed child the 3 hours. You can see that the time with interaction spent, here again we notice the deficit in this. Time being spent interaction with the ASD group, 5 hours. 9 hours for the control and typical developing, 7 hours for the language delay. Can we really afford any more children to get ASD without this research being further looked into? Enough separate research studies and evidence points to this being a very plausible trigger in a child with a pregenetic disposition to develop ASD when high amounts of early screen viewing are consumed in infancy. You can also ask your patients and families that you treat with ASD the same question. I believe in a reflective practice with my clients, and so I'll just ask the parents, what does your typical day look like? Tell me about this, tell me about that, and I would be surprised if you wouldn't find the same pattern. Since witnessing the red flags for ASD remediated by screen removal and a focus on social interaction in that first child and my own child, I've been recommending this intervention protocol to remove all screen media from a young child's view and that either has a diagnosis or red flags for diagnosis. As stated earlier, it's paired with social interaction, and I model for the families on how to engage their child in these intervention research-based strategies across daily routines and part of their play and their day. This works not only with children that, or I shouldn't say this works, this has been done with children not only in daycare but also with stay-at-home moms. I'm now seeing and documenting similar rapid results in other children, 7 children at this moment, with ASD whose families try this approach. I feel that minimizing the synthetic visual experiences of a brain that's already highly wired that way and focusing on an intense social interaction with the child with ASD, which is their weakness, the brain then will be given its best chance to develop more typically due to the high amounts of neuroplasticity of the young mind. I feel promoting a child's experiences with people in their faces and their real voices increases the development of social responses in the brain, and that this will lay the best foundation for typical growth and a development of a young child with ASD. And then the last slide talks about how I recommend completing a screen fast. One of my current professional goals is to learn all I can about how to help families unplug the screens and reconnect in a child with ASD for the sake of our children. They're too precious not to try this and to do this. The above books, the Reset Your Child Brain book that Dr. Doan mentions by Victoria Duncanley is a wonderful resource. The Virtual Child by another author Dr. Doan recommended, Chris Rowan, is a wonderful book filled with the most recent literature on how screen media is affecting our children. When I decided to remove all screen from Max's view, our whole family began watching a lot less screen time. What I noticed was my 6-year-old daughter, who had a diagnosed case of ADHD for the first time in a long, long time that I can remember, started showing better eye contact with me. So then we went and removed all screens from her too. So this meant that while waiting at the therapist, the pediatrician, and other places, I would ask the television to be turned off if we were the only ones there. If we weren't, I sat under it, or I would take him to the bathroom or even wait in the foyer. That's the kind of mom I was. I also asked the therapist to please, he was seeing 7 therapists at the time a week, to please stop using the iPad. They were more than happy to comply. They always haven't had iPads in therapy and speech and in OT and PT and all these other things, so they were happy to pull out the old methods. Most of the screen consumption was under my control due to his age, and the tantruming from the removal was short, just for a couple of weeks. The progress my son made was so rapid, so obviously related to the screen removal, that this created the internal motivation as his mom to continue to proceed forward for months until I felt like he no longer showed any of the core deficits for ASD. So now we watch about 1 to 2 movies together a week as a family. I'm not strict if the TV is on in the waiting room. I try to sit under it and I try to read to him. I still am doing all these things, but I'm not a Nazi about it right now. But the screen fast led to such great things for us all, and I'm currently involved with other families who are witnessing positive changes in their children that include increased eye contact, joint attention, physical closeness, and language. And these families all then feel the same similar motivation to keep those screens off, and the well-being that they feel based on their child bonding with them better. So we owe further research to this topic to our families and our children, especially our service members' families that have many of these at-risk factors for high screen consumption in early childhood. Could high screen consumption in early childhood be that silent and unsuspected trigger for an ASD in a child with a pregenetic disposition? Could pairing a screen-free protocol with traditional therapies? All these kids are involved in many different therapies. Could that provide a trajectory change that is positive and rapid for many young children with ASD? With the frequency that ASD rate has and its alarming rise, and the causal environmental factors still puzzling the ASD community? For our children and our families' sake that are affected, we cannot afford to delay in this determination. Thank you.